Hi there, my name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today is kind of a continuation of the things that we were doing for Dyslexia Awareness Month in October. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with Erin Eighmy, and we're going to be talking about dyslexia and phonological awareness. So why don't you give people a little bit of background about who you are?
Sure. So I currently am working for an intermediate unit in Pennsylvania in the United States. So we're in different countries, so this is pretty cool that we can talk via Zoom. And so my background is general ed and special education, and I've been we were just having a chat earlier about being involved with the International Dyslexia Association since the 90s. Is that dating us? I don't know. So just sort of following along with our moms, which that's a cool connection, in that realm of making, dyslexia was sort of um, a word that people didn't say in Pennsylvania for a really long time. And I do professional development now for teachers and schools in our region. So also on the Reading League Pennsylvania board. And that's been a really exciting adventure to open up our chapter in Pennsylvania and try to get the science of reading out to Pennsylvania educators, and educators from all over the nation are joining us, and from other countries. So it's really been a really exciting time in the science of reading right now. So
For sure, I love everything that's coming out from the Reading League. It's definitely a read when it arrives at home. So why don't we just talk about beginning, like what is dyslexia? How do you define dyslexia?
So we typically go based on the International Dyslexia Association definition, but I really did appreciate Debbie Hepplewhite's definition of a word-based difficulty in reading. Really simple, but there's a couple things that we share with teachers that I think are really important, that it's biological based, right, neurobiological. So it's just about how the brain is wired up. Some children are easily wired to read, and other students take a lot more structured approach to instruction, more practice, more intentionality. And so I think describing it in a way that makes sure that students know, right, that it's not something wrong, it's just how you're wired. And so typically, if you're talking about someone who may have dyslexia, you would probably be noticing difficulty with working with language, manipulating sounds, noticing rhyme when you're playing with language. So all of those um, phonological, which is sound-based activities, are difficult, or they don't come into play automatically, and they need instruction. So we're looking at implications of that difficulty to work with language. So it's a specific learning disability, really at the word level, decoding or reading words, pulling those words off the page accurately,
Mhm.
and also spelling. And spelling is overlooked, I think. It's like the stepchild of reading, but it really gives you a really nice insight into what is going on and what students understand.
For sure, and I think it is important whenever talking about dyslexia is to make sure that people understand that reading is not a natural process for any human, right?
Right.
Our brains don't have one dedicated reading zone. There are three areas that we have to integrate, and the dyslexic individuals need more scaffolding and facilitation to link these areas to become that skilled, confident reader.
Absolutely. So as teachers, if teachers are listening to this, that's our role, is to bring that phonological, right, that one area that is working with sounds, and the other area, which is your orthographic, is kind of like big language here, but how to recognize the difference between an N and an H, right?
Mhm.
Or that to notice that TCH represents a sound that's ch, right?
Mhm.
Those components have to match up, right, and talk to each other and create a neural pathway, and then connect it up to meaning, right? Because we can't just say sounds and not make meaning of it. That's always our goal. But yes, so I think that's the really important part about the dyslexia research that's been done all around the world, is that we don't have a region for reading, and we have to make it.
Mhm. And it's a little bit more difficult for others than it is for some. And I know, I'm sure you're familiar with Nancy Young's reading, ladder of reading,
Mhm.
right? So that, that's a great way to look at it, and seeing that, there are those some that just seem to have that natural affinity for it, like the kids that learn how to walk when they're, 8 months old, and
Yeah.
they're running all over the place. But then those ones that take a little bit longer, there is that natural range. But we do need to provide support early, and as best we can, to help these kids get the support they need to develop it. So let's take a moment and actually just talk about what phonological awareness is. I mean, we know it's an awareness of sound, but at what level?
So phonological awareness, there's two main terms I think that we should probably clear up.
Mhm.
Phonological awareness is the awareness of sound in bigger pieces, structures. So we can think about word level, understanding the differences between words, right, would be a really large piece of language. And then we get into syllables and onset rhyme. Rhyme would be like the vowel plus the ending of a word. And so that's the phonological awareness. It's that understanding that sounds can be thought about, right, metalinguistically, and
Mhm.
also manipulated. And so that is the key. It's really that shifting of how do I change the sounds and work with them to be able to discriminate between words. Um, and, when we're reading, being able to then interpret those words as different or similar, right, but different. And so then phonemic awareness
Yeah.
is that more fine-tuned, granular look at sounds. So we have individual sounds in our English language. We have about 44 sounds, and Dr. Louisa Moats, it always sticks with me what she says about phonemes, that if we didn't have an alphabetic system, there is no reason for us to take a word like sip and tell you all the sounds, right? Sip. There's no reason to do that. It's not something that occurs naturally, unless, right, you're rearing children in your home knowing that we're going to be reading and spelling with an alphabet. And so I think that's really important, that it's not something people who are either non-readers, right, who don't have literacy or they aren't literate, or they don't have an alphabetic structure for a written language. They don't do the parsing. They don't separate sounds and put spaces between that flow of sounds and words. So I think that's really the pinnacle of what is phonemic awareness. It's understanding that words are made up of sounds, and sounds aren't nice and clean. They don't always behave, right? Like k, right? And it's nice and sharp when you say it by itself, but when we put sounds together, they always get a little bit distorted. And so we have to pay even closer attention.
Of course. One of the things that I like to mention about phonological awareness is anyone that can comprehend spoken language has an unconscious awareness of phonological awareness, right? If they're able to discriminate between the different words in a sentence, they
Mhm.
have it at the word level, right? But when
Mhm.
we're teaching reading, we need to bring that to a conscious awareness. And that's where a lot of these children struggle, is bringing that unconscious awareness they have when they're listening to spoken language to their conscious awareness, so they can use that to help them with reading and spelling.
Right, and being really tuned in to details and making sure that we are clear, right, in enunciation, but then those individual sounds get mapped onto print. So that would be phonics, so three terms, I guess. So taking that speech and that system and encoding it in English is very complicated.
Mhm.
But the sound structure we have that for everyone who speaks English is the same. So the more educators know about how the sound system works, how language works, the more we can react to difficulties, and understand where students are in the progression, like you mentioned, right?
Mhm.
It's basic to be able to understand words and put spaces in there, and then that progression becomes more difficult, being able to tell me the first sound
Mhm.
in a word, right? What's the first sound in sun? Sounds, right,
Mhm.
than it is for the word cat, which we always use, right, which is actually really difficult. We start with k, which is hard. It's a stop
Yeah.
sound. And then we go to blending, putting sounds together, like sun, right, sun,
Mhm.
and taking those sounds apart. So those are basic phonological tasks that we should be seeing in classrooms every day,
Mhm.
especially in K and 1. I'm not sure if you call it kindergarten or not, but
Yeah.
kindergarten, okay. And in first grade, so 5 and 6, we're really working on paying attention to the beginning and separating sounds and blending sounds, to come up with words. And then we can get into the more advanced levels too.
Mhm. And do you want to talk about the relationship between phonological awareness and dyslexia? Because there's a huge correlation, right?
hmm So it is definitely a strong predictor. And so when you were talking about screening early, we know that students who struggle with anything phonological is a huge red flag, right? And we can then use that to drill in a little bit further to see what is going on. But that ability to work with sounds and consciously, right, and manipulate sounds, change those sounds around, and work with language is the core of dyslexia. And I think it's important to say that students that have dyslexia fall in a range.
Mhm.
So we can have students have mild difficulty and students who have really significant difficulty with language. But it impacts reading and spelling, but it also can have secondary effects. It can influence the amount that you read, right? The miles on the page. Because if you are struggling with something, you probably don't want to do it. So there's a motivation piece and also an access piece. If you don't read as quickly or as accurately, you don't learn as many words. And if you can't decode accurately, your comprehension will suffer. So over time, if we don't intervene early, those negative effects affect other areas of language, like from reading, right? Comprehension even. But language comprehension on its own usually is not the it's not the core issue with students with dyslexia. It's really that ability to work with language.
Well, and you can have a specific learning disability that has to do with the comprehension side too.
Sure.
We're focusing right on the dyslexia tonight and talking
Right.
about how the phonological awareness deficit really has a huge component to it. So how about we take a moment and talk about the progression between the difficulty of the levels of phonological awareness, starting at the word level and then going up to that phoneme level.
Sure. So it's you should notice in a typical developing reading a progression of skills that kids can pick up, and there's specific ages and ranges that you can look up. But essentially, toddlers come up with words, right? They start to speak words. Some other red flags tend to be delayed speech. So those are some red flags that you can look for. Speaking a word by age 12 months or so is sort of a general guideline. And then we are noticing syllables. So as toddlers, they can say da da, right? And they start clapping when you're singing songs, right? To those beats. So language is a rhythm. And vowels are really that central rhythmic pulse, right, in the language. And so when students are tuned into the language, they hear those vowel sounds, and that's where they clap. But students that may be sitting in your circle time, right, and you say, let's clap caterpillar, and they just clap and they're excited, you know that there's probably a red flag, right? Because it's a kind of intuitive finding that vowel sound at the syllable level. So moving from syllable level to a little bit more granular, being able to pop off the front, the beginning sounds in words. So like in the word split, let's say, being able to say split and having two parts. Then, so all of that component is what we would call the umbrella of phonological awareness. So anything that you get to the individual sounds would be phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness is where we need to teach. That is where we have to focus, because that is what has an impact on reading and spelling. So directly level skill, blending, segmenting first, isolation of sound. So isolating the first sound with the word ball, let's say, if you want to try it at home or on Facebook, and you say ball, students could, right, you can that b, 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 and do that bouncing speech sound, right? Hickety pickety bumblebee, little games like that that pull out that first sound. And that's what we're looking for in entrance of kindergarten. Preschool, pre-K should be able to start to pull off those first sounds. In a fun and playful way. And then getting into two sounds. How many sounds in the word at, right? At. And then three sounds. And then blending. So if I give you sounds like the word it, right? Can you put them together? If you can't put them together from there, let's try and stretch those out. Mit, and do like a continuous blending. So there's ways to scaffold each of those skills, and David Kilpatrick has a continuum of supports, making all of this language that's abstract, right, more concrete. And so that's a big thing that we talk about with teachers, is to bring that abstract. Louise Simons talks about the phonemes as being ethereal. You know, they float around, and if you don't tune into them, they're hard to nail down. So phonemic awareness, right, from individual sounds, and then we get all the way up into blending, segmenting, so taking those sounds apart, and then manipulating, so changing out sounds. So if I say sand, now change s to l, the word is
land.
Yeah. And you did it automatically, right? Because yes, we've had a lot of practice, but if you are proficient at being able to manipulate the language, that's what happens. It just pops out. Students that are having trouble, if they're older, they sort of look up and they're seeing the word in their head, and then they're replacing it with the letters, because they have that scaffold, right, of being able to spell somewhat, but it's not automatic for them. So we wanted to just pop out, and that is what gives you the utility of saving words in your letterbox, right, as sight words. That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to mention when we were talking about that onset awareness, or the first sound awareness, a lot of teachers will often do that with bringing the grapheme or the letter in it. And one thing that I wanted to highlight is the problem with doing that is there are different ways that we can represent phonemes, right? And like even for the sound k, it can be a K, it can be a C, it can be a CH. So at this point, you know, especially with these early kids, I would try and avoid bringing those letters into it. Just talk about the sounds and strictly stick to the sounds until you're teaching the letter sound correspondences in a phonics lesson, right?
Yeah, so I think that is a huge, they're complementary skills, right? So to be purely phonemic awareness, we don't have letters. So I think that's another piece to really be a conscientious consumer when products or programs are saying that this is phonemic awareness and it says show the letter cards or have kids look at words. We know that that's not phonemic awareness. And so to introduce a skill phonemically, like onset rhyme like this, I think you can see it. Is it going left to right here for you. Okay, so this would be your phoneme, your onset, and this would be your rhyme, and that's all you would see is something visual,
Mhm.
and not letters on top of that. But to scaffold, right, for students who need to be able to read and spell, we start with the representation, and then we add on, right, we map on those spellings intentionally, but that would be according to your scope and sequence of
Yeah, well,
teaching
and
them.
then even like the Elkin boxes, right? You can do this and
Absolutely.
still phonemic awareness because you're just talking about the speech sounds. T.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where we want to start. That's your first picture, right? And it has a meaning, so we know what the word is. It helps their phonological memory when you
Mhm.
have a picture or an object. And then we start scaffolding those things away. And but those are intentional ways that we start with phonemic awareness to make sure that we don't confuse the idea of the alphabetic principle with phonemic awareness.
Mhm. And these are activities that, I like to encourage parents to do, even, right? Counting the number of phonemes, thinking of words that begin with the same onset, rhyming games. They're really easy ones that you can do in the car
Yeah.
and, build in those sequences and activities. So it's just part of your communication with your child and supporting that. And it's only going to build the bond between your children, right?
Yeah, then they see it as a game, right? So
Exactly. So it's
I'm
not
thinking
just
of a word, and then you're like, ooh, and then you give them all the sounds, and they're blending.
yeah.
Um, yep,
And then it's not always reading instruction,
right.
especially for those kids that struggle with the phonological awareness. Okay, can you get your sh, ooh, right? And it's
Yeah.
dancing games. So just ways to support them with that. Now, when we're talking about phonemes, um, it's really important to make sure that you're saying the sounds crisply. And that's where I think phonemes and phonics gets a little bit murky because a lot of the phonics programs have it so you're saying extra sounds with the letter to kind of accentuate. Like B says ba for ball, right? But no, B says ba.
Right. So that is one area that we really want to focus on articulating as models
Mm-hmm.
and sending home even with parents a good little video clip, a snippet. A lot of programs have like a little sound library that's well done, but there are lots of resources and we could share those. But I always talk to the kids and their teachers when they're in the room about using your scissors, right? So we don't want to say "buh," we want to say "b,"
Mm-hmm.
nice and clean. But the reason we do that is to project, right? It's to make those sounds a little bit louder. If we have a class full of kind of a little bit rambunctious children, if they're not really tuned into you, you would have that tendency to add that vowel sound, that schwa sound.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important to work as a team to come in and listen to each other and have a critical ear that's also safe. And the R, right, the R is also another one that's really problematic. And the R doesn't represent it's a rumbling sound. So if you say the word rabbit, it's that r, right? And it's not but some of these phonemes are sort of not meant to be said by themselves.
Exactly. And
So it's
letters
hard,
that come before and after them manipulate how they're pronounced, right?
right?
And yeah, there's the whole vowel shift and all the things that have made English such the complex language that it is for the reading and the spelling. Um, Now, one problem that we haven't really talked too much about is with a dyslexic child, we mentioned the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness, but it goes even deeper than that because they can struggle with hearing the difference between the sounds and knowing how to shape their mouth when making those sounds. And do you want to get into a little bit about that, please?
Sure, sure. So those are when we're looking at some things like minimal pairs, maybe sounds that are very close in articulation to each other, which means just how does your mouth form that sound? What is your airflow doing? What are your vocal cords doing? How
Mhm.
is the air being pushed out? So we're thinking about two big ideas: manner, which is how the sound is produced, and then place.
Mm-hmm.
And so keying into something that's actually tactile. So multimodal is good for every student, but essential for students with dyslexia, because we need to put all of our senses into this. It's a difficult task. And so being able to tune into the sound is different than zzz, that
Mm-hmm.
voiced pair. But if I said, watch my mouth, zzz, you can't tell a difference, right? Because the place is the same. The place and the way my articulators, my tongue and my teeth and everything work are the same, but my vocal cords are turned on.
Yeah.
So we really need to be in tune with what's the difference between s and z. It's not the spelling, right? It's the sound, the voicing. And this will show up when we talked about spelling.
Mm-hmm.
Spelling is the window, and really, I think, into the phonological processing system. Where are the breakdowns happening? What do students confuse or not quite understand yet? And so, as teachers and parents, we can really say, try this. Put your hands backwards like this. I actually like to, it kind of makes its own little phone. But if you put your, I'll move my thing here, put your finger and close this little flap on your ear. Don't stick your finger in your ear. And then I lay my hands across my jawbone. You
Mm-hmm.
can really feel the vibration there, and it magnifies the sound. So if you do zzz there, it just sort of lights up your whole skull with vibration. So knowing the difference between those sounds, but then making sure that you're always saying, watch my mouth, for differences like and
Yeah.
really subtle, right? But the pop of air will give them that cue that it is, oh, that's not because they're keeping your mouth closed, right? Versus that pop of air. So there's lots of ways to tune in visually, feel your vocal cords, right? Tune into that voicing structure. And then what's your tongue doing? And most of us were not trained as speech pathologists. I wasn't. And so, learning that, we're not doing therapy or articulation therapy, but just knowing that your tongue for k is sort of lifted up in the back
Mm-hmm.
helps kids understand how to pronounce it and the differences between sounds. Um, so yeah, it just helps with cleaning those things up and connecting it to something concrete.
Mm-hmm. And phonological awareness difficulties or phonemic awareness difficulties don't necessarily go away once a child knows how to read. Right. So even an adult with dyslexia can still struggle with those phonological awareness issues. And you'll notice this when, some they may know like a Craig and a Greg and they mix it up. Right.
Yep, or reading photograph as phonograph and not
Yeah.
really noticing that it's not the same word,
Mm-hmm.
saying the wrong prefixes,
Yeah.
even though they've had lots of models. My son used to say, well, still says, we try to work on that, but re-race instead of erase,
Mm-hmm.
because right, is more common. So those subtle things that they don't really pick up on, the differences. But when you say words like that are sort of mixed up, other people notice, right? And so it is that sort of self-awareness piece, and we can really get into having difficulty with self-esteem and right, peers just kind of wondering if you have intelligence. And I think the point that we didn't make is that dyslexia has nothing to do with intelligence.
Different.
But that's a perception, right? That if you aren't able to read, in society who values reading almost above any other
Mm-hmm.
skill, that is an assumption. It's sort of a bias that we have. And so I think that everyone needs to understand that reading difficulty, right? Reading is not natural, and
Mm-hmm.
reading difficulty is common.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the way we teach reading creates difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, and understanding that the phonological awareness is that huge first step. I mean, we can screen for phonological awareness issues in before kids hit kindergarten, in 3 and 4-year-olds. We can notice these, and this is something that I think we need to kind of put that next push on in the early intervention, is noticing these weaknesses in students or in children and toddlers and preschoolers, and getting that speech and language support so they have the articulation therapy so that they're one step forward, right? Because these are things that, you know, your pediatrician or your general practitioner, if they're educated in how to assess this, you know, that speech therapy can be so impactful at a young age, so they have the skills going into school.
Yes. I mean, early intervention is crucial, and I think what we do as an education system, sort of tradition, is wait for kids to fail.
Mhm.
And when we know better, we need to react to those red flags, and it's not going to hurt anyone, but it certainly will make all the difference in learning to read, because we know the sooner kids get support, the more likely they will be to be on track.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I've loved our conversation.